Welcome to the Anti-Asian Racism Workshop Nights. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the land. Halton, as we know it today, is rich in the modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the lands of the Anishinaabe to the Arawanaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. We acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for being stewards of this traditional territory. My name is Sam, and this is my partner Ari. We're both freshman students here at St. Francis Xavier, and we're excited to talk to you about this issue. As the topics of Asian racism and xenophobia gain more traction, it's important that we have a conversation about some of the problems Asians face, their implications, and how you can help.
Before we begin, keep in mind that we will be covering topics such as hate crimes and racially motivated attacks. If any of these topics are triggering to you, please do not hesitate to ignore them when they are mentioned.
In 1902, the federal Canadian government conducted a royal commission on Chinese and Japanese immigration. Here's a quote from that commission. Asians are unfit for full citizenship. They are so nearly allied to a servile class that they are obnoxious to a free community and dangerous to the state. To provide some context as to how long this problem has existed in Canada, here are a few events from our history that demonstrate Asian racism. Starting off with the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. The construction lasted from 1881 to 1885. Around 15,000 Chinese workers were brought to Canada to work on this railroad. These workers endured harsh working conditions with little pay, and it's estimated at least 600 workers died working on this railroad. The spouses of the workers were left widowed, and the workers who survived had trouble finding jobs after the completion of the railroad, since Asians were being excluded from many lines of work for legal and social reasons. In 1885, shortly after the Canadian Pacific Railroad was completed, the Chinese head tax was implemented. Many politicians were worried that the huge influx of Chinese workers would have an impact on the community, both politically and economically. As a result, Chinese immigrants were forced to pay a $50 tax, $1,365 in 2021, upon arriving in Canada. They were the only ethnic group required to pay a tax in order to come into Canada. This tax was later raised to $100, and then to $500 in 1903, $15,049 in 2021. In the 38 years that this tax was active, around 82,000 Chinese immigrants had paid nearly $23 million in taxes.
Trigger warning. This slide mentions police violence and murder. If any of you get triggered by these topics, please do not hesitate to ignore this slide. In 1907, South Asian immigrants were banned from entering Canada. It wasn't until the late 40s that the legislation was changed to allow South Asians to enter Canada. The anti-Asian riots also happened that same year, in which hundreds of people rioted through Vancouver's Asian district to protest against Asian immigration to Canada. During this point in history, British Columbia held multiple discriminatory legislations and social practices, denying East and Southeast Asians the right to vote, practice law or pharmacy, be elected into the public office, serve on juries, or work on education or civil services. On May 23, 1914, over 376 arrived from India to the Vancouver harbor on a boat called Komagata Maru, all hoping for a better life in Canada. After a whole 2 months of deliberation, the government sent a Navy ship to the Komagata Maru and forced the boat to return to India. It was recorded that as the ship was leaving, the residents of Vancouver cheered. When they returned, many of those on the boat were beaten and or killed by police. This is only the surface of problems Asian Canadians have faced in the past, and we continue to face the implications of these problems today. Trigger warning. This slide includes mentions of hate crimes, racially motivated attacks, and physical assault. If any of these trigger you, please do not hesitate to ignore this slide. Due to COVID-19, hate crimes are on the rise, and Asian hate crimes are one of these problems, as we've seen more and more of them when COVID hit. In North America as a whole, the reported Asian hate crimes rose by 149% ever since COVID reached the continent. In Vancouver itself, the reported Asian hate crimes saw a 717% increase. Physical assault due to Asian hate crimes rose by 11%, and it is reported that 73.4% of Asian hate crimes fall under verbal harassment. These hate crimes have caused mental distress for 73.2% of those affected. Hate crimes committed against Asians have increased substantially during this pandemic, but they've always been here. The fact that over a third reported hate crimes were committed against Asians is appalling, and as a society, we must do better. One thing that many Asians face frequently would be the usage of microaggressions. A microaggression can be defined as an indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against a marginalized group. Even though it isn't blatant, microaggressions are still offensive. Microaggressions against Asians can take place in many different forms and can be delivered in many different ways. For example, the sexualization of Asians, Asian cultures, or the Foxeye trend.
Anti-Asian racism in the media. Asian roles in movies are generally seen as comedic roles. The media tends to pick certain things from cultures to present to the public via movies, shows, or books. They give the Asian characters thick accents and bully the field of work that has the biggest Asian population, for example, nail salons. In these shows, the media only takes the stereotypes of cultures to mock the culture. The media is one of the biggest causes of the normalization for POC racism. Since the media reaches a lot of people worldwide, it influences the way people act towards others, and especially in young children. Instead of doing good, the media chooses to set a bad influence and mock different cultures.
Like the media, our education system is very impactful, and it is a major cause of cultural colonialism at a young age. When students of color are thrown into an environment which lacks representation, they may feel a loss of identity, pressuring them to conform into the white standard in order to fit in. This can be found through the underrepresentation of people of color in the course material, the misrepresentation of people of color through the course material, the teaching of Eurocentric history, the lack of teaching and discussion of important months such as Asian Heritage Month, Islamic Heritage Month, Sikh Heritage Month, and the list goes on. This is an important issue to focus on since from an early age we begin to normalize an environment with racist undertones for children. Children are very impressionable. Most of them tend to mimic what people around them do, which influences their actions and choices. Over time, this impacts the way they think and act, and as they grow up, they could get bullied for their culture and growing to hate their own culture. They would try to whitewash themselves to become more normal, completely erasing their own heritage. The curriculum in HCDSB and HDSB school boards are very undiverse. For years now, the curriculum has stayed the same, implementing the same societal standards into the minds of young children. It's been over 20 years and still no change? As a student coming from an HCDSB elementary school, I think that we should stop with the coloring books and start teaching kids about cultural diversity. Elementary school is the start of everyone's lives and it builds our foundations. We must set good examples and show kids that everything and everyone should be loved to abolish society's standards of normal.
The model minority myth has impacted all Asian communities negatively. It is seen as a positive thing, but it is not. The myth states that all Asians are academically smart and hardworking, which all seem like positive features, but this standard that society has put on the Asian community is the main cause of the physical and verbal abuse of Asians. This model minority standard is promoted in the media via shows that are shown globally. The model minority myth also disguises Asian struggles, making it look like they're already well off and don't need any help. And if there is a problem, they have the ability as hard workers to solve the problem on their own. This myth also sets a ridiculously unrealistic standard for Asians, depicting them as perfect, naturally smart, hardworking, and self-reliant. This raises a serious issue since lots of people take this image of Asians put out there in the media as if it was a real thing, and they start to force Asians into that box. Additionally, the model minority myth has been weaponized against other minorities. as white supremacists use this microaggression to instruct other minorities to behave similarly to this trope, gaslighting them into somehow solving their own problems and submitting to the white people around them. It's because of the weaponization of this trope that the model minority myth earned its name. This standard is so normalized that the school district in Washington decided that Asians aren't students of color. They decided this because the academic margin between Asian students and white students were both similar and higher compared to the other colored students. Since they were academically on par with the white students, the school district saw the big opportunity gaps between Asians and other students of color, so they labeled them as white to eliminate the opportunity gap. However, this move erases Asians of their identity, and it hides away the struggles they face as people of color. Just because we may seem well off does not mean we don't face countless struggles as well.
Cultural appreciation is when we respect cultural diversity and celebrate them respectfully. It is when we want to learn about a culture and understand it. When we do this, we must respect each culture and never judge their traditions. By doing this, we can become more culturally diverse and learn about each other. It is amazing to be curious about different cultures and to ask questions, but we must remember to be respectful while learning about that culture. Cultural appropriation is when we choose certain things from cultures and make it a trend. For example, sexualizing traditional clothing or the foxeye trend. Cultures are not trends. They should be respected and they should not be sexualized in the media. We should respect cultures as a whole, and while doing this, we should respect our own cultures as well. We should not attempt to change ourselves to become another race or culture. We must accept ourselves and love others.
Just a short trigger warning before we start the slide. This slide will mention self-harm, physical assault, and emotional distress due to the aforementioned items. Asian racism can affect the Asian community in multiple ways: mentally, physically, and emotionally. Being discriminated against for your culture can lead you to despise yourself and your origins. Many Asians have wanted to stop or hide their traditions to fit the white standard of Western society, which is considered to be normal. An example of this would be how some Asians feel pressured to not eat their traditional foods out in public, out of the fear that they'll be judged for their food and how they eat it, while also being labeled as foreign or exotic. It might not be apparent, but this happens very often with many Asians, so it's important to understand this. It's also possible for Asians to be physically harassed or even killed, as we've seen a spike in hate crimes since the pandemic started. Racially motivated attacks can and have left victims hospitalized with serious injuries. The fact that the target of most of these attacks are Asian elders isn't at all consoling either, and many Asians now worry on a regular basis for the safety of their loved ones. Racism can also be very emotionally damaging, seeing as families can be sent into a lot of distress if their loved one was the victim of a hate crime. Even just the fear that it could happen to yourself or loved one can be a lot, and seeing how hate crimes have increased and are now a trending topic, more Asians likely feel this way. Asians can also feel and think less of themselves because of the racism demonstrated against them, leading to a low self-esteem and mental health problems.
Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter.
Being an ally to the Asian community is one easy and practical way to help us in small yet meaningful ways. To become an ally, you must first recognize your own privilege and how this grants you things that minorities wouldn't have. For example, you may be a white, straight, male, non-disabled, and a Christian. In all these cases, you would see people like yourself represented more often, have more access to quality services, have a bigger say politically and socially, and you wouldn't have to fear the system and other people who could potentially discriminate against or oppress you. The next step after recognizing your privilege would be to educate yourself on the matter. Do your own research on what goes and what doesn't, and don't hesitate to ask appropriate questions when necessary. When asking a question about this matter, be careful to word your questions properly to avoid coming off as rude. One way to communicate your questions in a polite way would be to use I statements as opposed to you statements. For example, phrase your question as, I'm not familiar with your culture. Is it okay if you could tell me about it? As opposed to, why do you do things like that? That's not the way people do it here. Please listen to what the Asian community is saying, and don't devalue or invalidate our words. This is extremely important. as we can only benefit from your allyship if we're taken seriously. Using what you've gathered, do your best to create a more inclusive environment for Asians. Make sure not to use any microaggressions, ask questions properly, call out others when needed, and to stay respectful overall. Another point to keep in mind is that you are an ally to the Asian community, not a representative. Please do not speak on behalf of the Asian community, as you don't fully understand what it's like to be one of us, but rather be willing to listen and act according to what we know will help make a more inclusive environment for all of us.
How can you identify if you're being racist? In our modern society, racism and racist jokes against minority groups, especially Asians, have been normalized. This comes as a result of history, institutions, and power. As the British took over the world and tried to colonize all countries, they gained power and tried to strip people from their cultures. The work of the colonizers created a barrier between the people of color, and over time, this became the norm. Although racist actions toward minority groups have been normalized, these actions should not be tolerated. The racist jokes and blaming others for things that they didn't cause, for example COVID, are hate crimes and they must be stopped. Just because you didn't know you were being racist doesn't make what you did or said any less racist either. We should not judge others because of their heritage or physical features, because this stigma has created disadvantages for people of color, making them less likely to gain higher positions in society or be represented properly, and they are seen as an inferior member of society. How can I stop? Before you speak to others who are part of minority groups, stop and think about what you're going to say and if it could be hurtful in any way. This applies to everyone. Just because you have a friend who is a person of color does not mean you only have to respect them. No matter who they are, everyone must be respected. In fights, racism tends to come out because of anger, but no matter what, racist jokes are not funny and they should not be tolerated. Do some research beforehand and ask respectful questions before assuming things. When you do ask questions about a culture, make sure your question is respectful. This is why research beforehand is vital. We must all understand that people of color are people too, and they deserve to be treated with respect. No one deserves to be discriminated against. If we all come together, we can fight this stigma and create a better world. What can we do about this? By spreading awareness about this issue via Instagram or social media, we can raise public awareness. We should not be silent. We must listen to others and fight for social justice. Don't be a bystander. Speak up. We must speak out when discriminatory behavior occurs around us and educate those who are misinformed. Protest and sign petitions. When we protest or sign petitions, we are making our beliefs more heard to the public. When we do this, it helps society take another step towards equality. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. Discuss about anti-Asian racism, allyship, or any other topic brought up. The floor is open for discussion.
Thank you for attending our anti-Asian racism presentation nights. We hope that you all leave more educated about anti-Asian hate crimes and how to become an ally. We all must work together to create equality in our communities.